Scientific research on the effects of pesticide exposure during the in utero period or gestational period linked exposure to pesticides to later childhood cancers. Children are developing rapidly, and pesticides and other chemicals can interfere with that development. Chemicals that can get into the body can cross the blood-brain barrier, which is not completely protected, so it can get to the brain. The other fact is that children are more susceptible because they're actually exposed more. Children crawl around on the ground. They have more hand-to-mouth behaviors. So they're actually more exposed. They get more into the body. They're more susceptible. There's been a body of research. They've shown a whole range of outcomes. Some lower IQ among children who are exposed gestationally or shortly after birth, and behavioral development such as ADHD. And so they've shown associations with leukemia and with brain tumors with pesticide exposures in children. Pesticides are designed to kill. They have many different mechanisms of being toxic. While children, we've talked about, are more susceptible, adults are also going to be affected with exposure to the pesticides. With pets, in many ways, they also have behaviors like young children that can increase their exposure. The regulatory structure in the United States has a long, sad history. And so for many of the pesticides that are most commonly used out there, they had almost no testing. Pesticides shouldn't ever have been considered safe because the whole point of pesticides is to kill. So pesticides have always been selected because they were toxic. Also within the spectrum of pesticides, we've had histories where a pesticide like DDT was used extremely widely because it was considered essentially non-toxic. And as we know, it's been associated with cancer, devastating impacts on the environment. In fact, was eventually banned. So what we've been talking about is really, what are the hazards of pesticides? What are the concerns about pesticides? What can we do with this information? And what we should do with this information is we should take a more health protective approach to our environment. So we all love the environment of Irvine, but we want Irvine to be a truly safe and healthful city. And the important thing to understand is that there are options. It's not that you have to heavily use pesticides in order to maintain the postcard picture perfect Irvine that we know and take care of our environment.
Good evening, Mayor Choi and members of the council. My name is Bruce Blumberg. I'm a professor at UC Irvine. My slides will be up in a moment in the Department of Developmental and Cell Biology. I received my PhD training at UCLA, and I was a postdoc at UCLA and at the Salk Institute. I want to talk to you briefly tonight about the science of endocrine disruption. You've heard about toxicity of pesticides, and in fact they are toxic, but they're toxic, as Professor Baker said, in a variety of ways. One thing that we should be aware of is that all forms of non-communicable diseases are on the rise in recent years. You can highlight a few: leukemia, brain cancer, difficulty conceiving and maintaining pregnancy, autism, obesity. The main question is why? So I and many of my colleagues believe that endocrine disrupting chemicals, that is, chemicals that affect the function of the endocrine system, are at least partly responsible for this. And I've provided the council members the recent World Health Organization, United Nations Environmental Program report on the state of science of endocrine disruptors. These chemicals are often persistent pollutants or dietary components that disrupt the normal functioning of our body. They increase the risk of many cancers. For example, a woman's risk of breast cancer is related to her total lifetime exposure to estrogens, including estrogenic chemicals in the environment. Leukemia, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and brain cancers have all been associated with endocrine disruptor exposure. There are quite a few endocrine disruptors. This is a partial list from the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, and you may notice that there are several here that are of concern to the discussion that we're having: 2,4-D, atrazine, glyphosate, pyrethroids. These are all endocrine disrupting chemicals that are used routinely. Another important point is that whether we like it or not, we all carry a body burden of toxic chemicals. The Environmental Working Group tested 417 chemicals in the umbilical cord blood of pregnant women, and they found 287 different chemicals. Of those, 180 are known to cause cancer in animals or humans, 217 are neurotoxic, 208 are developmental toxins. An important question is, did any of these moms or children give informed consent for this exposure? Did they benefit from it in any way? Is this a good idea? Lastly, I'd like to address some myths and reality in endocrine disruptor science. The first myth is that the EPA, under the aegis of laws like FIFRA and TSCA, tests the effects of chemicals on humans and assures that they're safe. Sadly, the reality is EPA doesn't test chemicals, and they require that the testing is done by the manufacturers of those chemicals. EPA practices the precautionary principle, as they do in Europe, which is precautionary principle is encoded into the law. In fact, the law in the US requires substantial certainty of harm to humans to be demonstrated before a chemical can be unlicensed. Another myth is that the EPA, the USDA, and various agencies measure the levels to which we're exposed and make sure that we're protected from toxic levels. The reality is that they don't do exposure assessment. These exposures are inferred from modeling, and they rarely, if ever, measure actual exposures. Lastly, it's a myth that EPA and other agencies use state-of-the-art modern science to evaluate chemical risk. The reality is that the science that they use, if you can call it that, is archaic, 50 years old plus, and is heavily influenced by the registrants of the chemicals. I'd like to sum up by saying that the data supporting adverse health consequences of pesticides are very strong. Even if you were to accept the possibility that there's controversy, when there's uncertainty, we have to decide which way should we err in making public policy. What will be the cost of waiting for evidence demonstrating substantial certainty of harm in humans before we act to restrict exposure? I personally think that we have enough evidence to act. Lastly, aren't our children, grandchildren, and future generations the most important consideration? I and many of my colleagues have shown that chemical effects can be passed down across the generations, and that does not happen by mutations in DNA. That happens by another mechanism which we could go into at great length another time. Lastly, sadly, this is what we're doing. We're conducting a very large-scale experiment. So I like this slide quite a bit, and this is a federal regulator telling a child that we do test for the safety of pesticides in your food and environment. It's kind of a long-term test, which means we are the test subjects. And I don't think that's a very good idea. Thank you very much.
Thank you.